I think that belonging is the foundation to so much of the human experience. But belonging with an empire is always conditional. You belong so long as X, Y, and Z, or you belong if X, Y, and Z. And I think that that's what we see in the church, right? You belong if you do these things or say this prayer or believe this exact, theology. But what would it look like to belong to a community or belong to a people that you belonged with no ifs or buts or conditions?
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Belonging shouldn't come with conditions. Yet so often, in a world shaped by empire, it does. Kat Armas returns to Shifting Culture to share from her new book, Liturgies for Resisting Empire, a powerful invitation to rediscover community, belonging, and peace in a dehumanizing world. Together, we talk about how empire has seeped into our language, our theology, our sense of time and productivity, and how we could begin the lifelong work of untangling it from our hearts and minds. Kat points us toward embodied resistance, putting our hands in the soil, resting when we're weary, listening to wisdom from the margins, and belonging without ifs or buts. We explore how Jesus subverts the violence of empire, not with power or domination, but through peace, love, and shared humanity. This conversation is a liturgy of reimagining, a reminder that another way of living and another way of belonging is possible. So join us. Here is my conversation with Kat Armas. And Kat, welcome back to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you back on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into Resisting Empire. Your new book, Liturgies for Resisting Empire, I think is fantastic. I love the subtitle because we're seeking community, belonging, and peace in a dehumanizing world. I think dehumanization is a big problem. I think we've forgotten how to be human. So how does empire dehumanize us? Like, what is empire? Let's start with that. Like, what is empire? Because that's a big old topic and it's a big thing, and we all have different ideas of what that is. So what do you say? What do you mean when you say empire?
Yeah, well, that is the question, right? What is empire? I think that was actually the reason why I wanted to write this book. I write about this in the book, but I was sitting, I've been studying post-colonial theology and theory for several years. And I was sitting with some seminary friends and I'm sort of talking about empire and I'm saying, man, these conversations we're having in the academy, and I think that we need to be having them outside of the academy because there's just so many conversations happening, right? And so my friends sat there with me and they, their eyes sort of lit up and they were like, oh my goodness, we were just sitting with our church friends and, in small group or whatever. And we started talking about this very topic and we were like Googling Webster's dictionary, like what is empire, because it really is such a big convoluted term, idea, just thing in general. So I will say, to answer that question, there is so many ways you can answer that question. There are so many different sorts of definitions and so many experts and historians and, all sorts of things, political theorists, and they'll give you all different kinds of answers. So I think for me, I wanted to focus on more, modern, right? Like how has empire affected us in America, more modern day, and specifically the church, right? I think that's what, because this is obviously a theological book, a book about, book with liturgies. I wanted that to be the sort of the main focus. So I will say, in general, empire is really just a relationship between a dominant ruling state and then a less dominant one, right? So it's a relationship between a dominant power and, a more, I guess you can say, oppressed or less dominant power. Originally, it meant sort of a state or a political system governed by an emperor. And then in the time of Rome, that sort of moved to include the idea of expansion. And so the idea of sort of holding power across distant lands and distant people. And so that's where you literally see, right, like empires going in and taking control of other lands, not their own, and other people's, right? And this, of course, with it comes so many things. I mean, you're talking about culture and language and just so many other things that come alongside of it. Now, empire in the modern sense, I mean, we still sort of have that, old school, and I did air quotes here, old school idea of empire as in like physically, marching into other lands and seizing them. But now we see more of this idea of imperialism, which is what I like to understand as the energy behind expansion, right? The sort of the spirit behind conquest. So like the US and Latin America, right? Or the idea that, McDonald's and Amazon and Disney have so much power, cultural power over other, quote unquote, distant parts of the world. And I just mean distant as in relation to, the Western US. So yeah, I think so that essentially is what empire is. And when I talk about empire, I'm looking at that more of this idea, this energy of control and dominance over other people's culture and other people's just way of being, way of thinking, way of just being in the world, right? And so I focus on, Christianity, and obviously there's no official Christian empire, but the way that Christianity functions in the world is much like an empire, right? It is a relationship of dominance and control. And, and we might talk about this more later, but just the idea of, the way missions, work happens across the world. I mean, you're not just sharing Jesus, you're sharing your version of Jesus, your version of Christianity, your version of morals and values. And, so it's way more than what Christianity sort of presents itself. It really is a relationship of dominance. And with that comes hierarchy, comes coercion, so many of these things that really we're just trying to undo, and really what I argue the early church was trying to undo as well. So yeah, it's a convoluted, question, and maybe also a convoluted answer.
So those big forces, as they come and they actually go around the world now, imperialism is happening around the world. It seems like there's a monoculture that is happening. It
Right,
seems to be like this force is merging all the cultures together to create one monolithic culture
right,
that we're losing some of ourselves.
right.
How do
Yeah.
we start to like untangle what we've lost and what we are losing when empire controls and we forget what being human in a community looks like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that is, again, sort of the question. How do we untangle it? And I mean, that's what I'm attempting to do. I think there's so many ways to untangle, and I think that is, I think essentially what you're asking also is like, how do we decolonize, right? Like if empire is essentially this colonizing force, then how do we decolonize? How do we untangle the tentacles of empire from our, hearts and minds and bodies? And I think that is a journey that we are going to be on for the rest of our lives. I think, that's sort of what I argue in this book, is that the ideology, plural, of empire are so intertwined into how we think and how we just understand ourselves as human beings, how we understand God, how we relate to one another, how we belong. They're so intertwined into our daily lives that I think untangling them is going to take a consistent, intentional, lifelong effort, right? And that's not something that should discourage us, or I think it can be creative, right? There's so much creativity, so many ways to, what we say, quote unquote, resist. And there's so many ways to, yeah, to stand against these ideologies. And it depends on, who we are, what our passions are, where we fit and function in this world. And I think that there are different ways that we can untangle, right? I think for all of us, it would do us well to get to know the earth, right? That's one way that I feel like we can begin to disentangle, like literally physically stick our hands in the dirt, get to know the earth from which gives us life and breath and food. And I think understanding the ways that we spend our money. I mean, yeah, there are so many ways, right? How we understand our relationship to productivity and to time, what's our relationship to, or even how we think about duality and I mean, there's really so many ways we can untangle. And I hope that in this book, we can kind of see just in a different ways. I talk about, how our relationship to our body can change, and how our relationship with that, I kind of put the body and time together, which might seem like two different things, but really they're not. I think how we view time and how we view our bodies, I think, are inextricably connected because of things like capitalism. But yeah, I think that untangling is a lifelong intentional effort that requires us to really pay attention and learn. I think, that's another reason why I wrote this book. I think it's important that we kind of know how we got here, right? Like, what are we talking about when we say empire? How did we get here? What are the ideologies of empire that have seeped into our bones, really? And yeah, how can we start to point those out in our own personal lives and then begin to entangle them? I think of some of these ideologies include like hierarchy, for example. How do we engage in hierarchical relationships in our family, in our, in how we engage at work, at church, wherever it is? How does hierarchy seep into our thinking and our way of being? As a mom, I think about that all the time. Of course, it's my job to lead and guide my children, but is it really a relationship where I see my children as equal and I am guiding them as equals? And yes, of course, I might know more and have lived longer. And yes, my brain is more rational and all the things, right? But I think there is, a dimension of how hierarchy has, bred so much of toxic thinking and upbringings, and so much of the ways that we have harmed our children by seeing them as really nothing on the ladder of hierarchy. Or productivity, right? How do we push our bodies and ourselves, and what does our work ethic look like? What do we expect from our family members, our children? What do we expect from the people we work with or for? What do we demand of them? So I think, yeah, there's so many ways we can untangle. And I think it begins with knowing how we got here. What are the ideologies of empire that have seeped into our bodies and our bones? And how does it affect us personally? And how can we begin to say, oof, yeah, I have a really, really messed up relationship to time, or to productivity, or to the way that I see reality is very dualistic, or I don't have a very diverse pool of what I'm learning from, or who I'm learning from, or the people that surround me. Or I do see the world in very much dominance and sort of submission type of way. Or violence is a big one. I know empire, one of the main things of empire is violence. And how has it infiltrated our theology, even our language? I talk about this in the book, but the way that we talk, the way that we, worship is so steeped in militaristic language. So I think it's all of these things put together, can help us to untangle. Sorry, that was a really long response, but there's so many ways.
I want to actually then bring it back into Jesus and our faith and Christianity and what that looks like. Give me just like a brief, like foundational, what did Jesus bring to this world? What is like a foundational faith? And where has like the language of empire veered us off path from what Jesus brought to us?
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll start with the last question, our language, right? So I'll start with kind of where we're at and where we've been, and then sort of where Jesus, what I've seen in the life of Jesus, and I know we talk about a lot in just in general conversation and culture. But yeah, I mean, we are steeped in, militaristic and violent ideologies and language. I mean, I wrote about a chapter in my book, but also it's on Substack and various places on the internet. But I remember being a kid, and, one of our main things was, we're in the Lord's army. And I'm here this like, young in Sunday school. I was raised Catholic. So even in catechism, class, and I'm here marching and pretending I have a sword. And that's, it's funny, but it's also like, that's how we really understand our relationship to God, and as a, response, our relationship to others in the world, as being in this cosmic battle, this cosmic war. Because we're so used to that, you might hear that and think, well, yeah, there's good and evil. Fine. I'm not saying that good and evil don't exist, whatever. But what I'm saying is that we're conditioned from early on to think that we constantly have to be fighting and constantly have to be suppressing and dominating and controlling and coercing, right, in order to belong to this sort of, eternal divine kingdom. And the reason for that is, and because that's in the Bible, right? I mean, you have Ephesians 6 and it's in the Bible. But what I'm sort of arguing in my book and, is that the reason why so much of the language in scripture is militaristic is because the Bible was written within empire to a people that were trying to contend with what it meant to live within the empire, right? And so that's the only language that they had, right? Is we live in this extremely violent, oppressive, and suppressive empire. And that's what our language, that's the framework that they had, right? They couldn't envision anything different because it didn't exist, And so when the Bible was written, it was written with this language in mind. And then, of course, it's just been read, quote unquote, literally. And so we've continued that language in this, sort of frame of thinking for, thousands of years. When I argue that when you look at the life of Jesus, while Jesus and the authors in scripture and many of the writers in scripture also, they do use that militaristic language, so much of it is so much of it is both a subversion to the empire and also I argue sort of like a capitulating to the empire because again, there was no other imagination, right? And so, talking about dualism and paradox, I don't think the Bible is a straight anti-imperial manifesto. I also don't think the Bible is a pro-empire, book either. I think what it is, as I mentioned, it's people contending. How do I do this thing? Just how we are people contending. How do I do this thing, right? How do I, you asked me, how do we untangle? That is the question. And I think that is the question that the New Testament writers were asking, right? How do we wrestle with this thing? How do we belong to an eternal kingdom when we're living in this violent, suppressive, and oppressive kingdom? How is it supposed to look different? And I think we can see in various places how it's supposed to look different, right? I mean, you have Jesus literally turning his cheek when he, and when he gets hit by when they come at him, he turns the other way. And there's just so much of what he's saying is, this is not how we are supposed to be. We are not supposed to define ourselves by the way that empire defines us, but by how God and God's kingdom does. And this is that there is no hierarchy. There is no Jew. There is no Greek. There is no there is diversity in this kingdom, right? It is not a mono kingdom, as you mentioned, a monoculture. We are to be in community and resting and living as the seasons guide us, right? Look at the flowers. They don't worry or stress. I don't think that that's like hey, don't stress. I think it's watch how the seasons and the earth provides, right? There are so many ways that Jesus is pointing us to, hey, live this way. And I think the authors are also contending with that, right? They're saying, ooh, but also, this is violent here. And, so I think it's just a conversation that we're having, they were having too.
I want to go into Ephesians 6 if you want to. Can we go into
Sure.
Ephesians 6, the full armor of God? So when this language of armor, it's a militaristic language, Paul's saying we don't struggle against flesh and blood. So he's saying it's not actually a physical, violent type of passage, but we take it to be physically violent. So can you just help somebody dealing with this passage? Because we use it all the time. We're having kids put on their armor, They got all this stuff. How do we actually then talk about this in a way that it dispels some empire and militaristic language, but it actually shows us what Paul was getting at and what we're supposed to do? Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com. And with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, yeah, so, the full armor of God that Paul is talking about in Ephesians 6 obviously is speaking to Roman, like what the armor that the Roman military wore, right? They wore breastplates and swords and, all the things, right? Which is funny because, yeah, we talk about that now, but also this is not even our armor. Like we don't even wear that armor. So it's, but anyway, yeah, so that's what the Roman military wore. And so Paul's, saying, yeah, put on that armor, and he's talking about the breastplate, and he's talking about the helmet and all the things. Hold on, let me pull it up here. The belt and the breastplate. But notice that when he brings up this armor, he turns the imagery, right? So you have, you think about a sword and a helmet. This is all like very defensive, very like, ready to fight sort of imagery. But then he says, stand firm with the belt of what? Truth, right? Like that truth is not this defensive armor. Like, no. And then he says, and the breastplate of what? Of righteousness or justice, right? With your feet with the gospel of peace, right? So he's like taking this language, and so much of, I think, this ideology and these narratives are instilled in us through language. Language is so important. And language was, when it comes to empire, when it comes to colonization, language was the thing that the colonizers sort of used to colonize, right? English is sort of became like the main language, and everything was sort of, set up against this backdrop of the English language. So anyways, side note on language, but yeah, and then he says, your feet with peace. And then the shield, right? Now it's a shield of what? Of faith. And this is how we can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one, with peace, with, truth, with justice, with all of these things that are so anti the empire. The empire was not about truth. The empire was not about justice or righteousness. The empire was not about peace. It was the opposite, right? Peace, peace, they say when there is no peace. It's all about violence and warfare. And so I think that here you have like this very, very obvious and direct subversion of empire. It's like saying, all right, let's take your guns and your, whatever. And instead, like they say, right, like plowshares, or instead we're going to turn them into flowers. I don't know. You know what I mean? So it's like this very direct subversion, but because we've so been trained and we've so, militaristic language and violent language is so normal and common and comfortable for us, that we read that and we're like, oh yeah, cool, peaceful, but also put on that armor because we're going to war. We kind of ignore the rest where you're like, yeah, peace, righteousness, truth, whatever. But no, but you're in battle, guys. So you know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's, I think it is a direct subversion to empire. Now, that's not to say that everything Paul says is a direct subversion to empire. I think, Paul was a man that lived in the empire. There was a lot of things that Paul said, or, Ephesians, I'm not going to say Paul here, but there was a lot of things that the authors of scripture said that were, yeah, they were steeped in militaristic language. And I think that's why it's our job as faithful and, learned, contemporary scholars of the Bible to understand this history and this context, to be able to say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Not to outright say I'm not going to use this passage, but to just understand the language or to understand why certain things were said and why others weren't and how they differ from, our current context.
Yeah, one of your chapters you talk about ideology, so rejecting ideology and then embracing wisdom. Ideology itself is something that it's kind of difficult, I think, for people to grasp a hold of what it is, what it looks like. Hannah Arendt, I'll just tell you one of her quotes about ideology. She says, "An ideology differs from a single political opinion in that it claims to possess either the key to history or the solution for all the riddles of the universe, or the intimate knowledge of the hidden universal laws which are supposed to rule nature and man." And so I think that these ideologies that empire has thrown at us, that we say, okay, this set of ideas really unlocks everything. I'm going to hold to that. And if you don't hold to that, you're wrong. We're basically saying that ideology trumps humans,
Right.
and we're going to actually kill or be killed over these core ideas that we believe, because we think that this is actually the key to the universe.
Yeah.
How do we know that we're holding on to an ideology rather than the wisdom of God?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's harder now more than ever, I think, because of just the world we live in and the way that these ideologies are so passed on. And, it's funny, I had a relationship with someone really close to this person. And, her and I, we adored each other. And then throughout the whole, election season, I watched this person go from not necessarily a Kamala Harris supporter, I know a lot of people didn't like her, even people on the left, fine, to all out Trump. I mean, all out bought out for Trump signs. And, and this is a person, person of color, like someone, and I only say that to say that we live in a very unique time in history. Barbara F. Walters, she's the author of How Civil Wars Start. Incredible book. If you haven't read it yet, it's alarming and, sobering. And she talks about how we live in a unique time in history where, and I hate to be on social media, but really, I mean, so much of these, narratives, and that's something I want to say about ideologies, that they are narratives, but so much of these narratives are, they're in front of us and they're so quickly digestible without nuance, without context. And it's so easy to become radicalized over and so easy to, believe ideologies just from a flip of your thumb. Right. And so anyways, I bring up this person that I loved because I remember, they would send me these videos, these, TikToks and Instagram videos and, watch this and, oh my goodness, and I would say, I don't consume my news that way. Like I just kept saying, I'm not going to watch this video because I don't consume my news that way. Send me an article. Send me an article that is fact checked. And, that's what I want to read. And they said, well, I'm a busy parent and I don't have time to read those articles. And so this is how, and I thought, wow, no judgment to that person in the sense that like, I'm a busy mom too. And I get that, I totally get that. But I think that, we've come to a place in our society where, we just need it quick. And so ideology now just becomes easier than ever to believe as sort of the key, the solution, whatever. Now, that's just sort of a side note, but I say that to say that ideologies sort of sustain themselves through narratives, right? I believe that ideologies become what they are through the telling of stories. And so we sort of believe these narratives, we've believed them throughout history. And it's these stories because that's how we understand ourselves, that's how we understand the world, is through story, right? And so when we believe these really, whether it's stories that draw fear, whether it's stories, and a lot of them are, ideologies do happen through fear-driven narratives, right? And so, and I saw this in this person that I had a relationship with. I saw this. It's this narrative, and I'm seeing this sort of narrative form in their minds and in their lives, and I'm watching how everything that they're scrolling through is sort of, responding to and affirming this narrative. And so I think when it comes to ideology, the dominant powers, they have the power to sort of shape, create, or silence narratives. And that's the history of colonization, right? To be colonized is to have your story sort of stripped from you, to have the ability to tell your story or your story to be taken from you. I mean, you look at just the way that throughout history, colonizers have been able to justify colonization is through the telling of stories, right? I mean, like I write about in my book, you have Alexander the Great carried the Iliad in his hand. I mean, these are just like, yes, these are stories of triumphant. I mean, that's the role the Bible has played for many, in the role of Christianity. It's just been this story of a triumphant warrior God, suppressing the evil enemy. And that can look like so many different things. And so I think ideology is steeped in narrative, right? And when the narrative gets distorted, I think that that's how we can just kind of go with that story. And we see it, I mean, the way that even now, I mean, certain stories are being suppressed and history is being changed. And, well, the history of this, wasn't that bad. Or, I know that in Florida, that the curriculum was changed to say that slaves benefited from slavery, right? Those who were enslaved benefited from slavery. Just it could be the most, seemingly simple and seemingly smallest changes to the narrative. But I think that is how ideology sort of sustains itself and thrives. If we have a narrative that we need to be afraid, or that we are losing, or whatever it is, then the solution becomes, this is what we need to do, and we will die for this thing because this is the only thing that will save us. This is the only person that will save us. And that is another huge thing about empire, is the idea that empire is the savior, right? Even though empire causes, right, the sort of the need for salvation, it then presents itself as the savior. I mean, you look at Rome, and it's funny, I talk about, if you've ever been to Rome, you can see this. I mean, Rome was all about the narrative it told of itself, right? And so you go to Rome and you see all the porticos and all the statues, and they all have engravings on them. And that's how, they sort of told the story of Rome. And in all of these engravings, you have this story of this, that Rome defeated the enemy, and Rome, protected itself by subduing the barbarian, and, all of these things. And, a lot of these are feminized, right? A lot of these people that they are subduing are a lot of the time, these feminine looking, beasts or creatures or people. And this is the story it told, and it's funny because in Rome, and also in the history of empire, it's sort of like this, oh, well, it's self-defense. They're coming after us. And so we just have to defend ourselves. And therefore, we will do anything to defend ourselves. When, really the only threat is empire itself, right? So I think when it comes to ideology, I think it's steeped in narrative and fear-based narratives. And it's a story that is created so that it can sustain itself.
So empire, you say, also then creates this dualism, right? That's binary thinking. It's us versus them. They're attacking us. We're defending ourselves. It is power over. How do we resist this binary thinking, way of thinking, and hold the tension of paradox of what is reality on the ground and what is real, and not just this dualism, which is really harmful today?
Right. Yeah, I think dualism is a really, 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 really hard one, because dualism is so embedded into Western thinking, not just theology, but just general thinking. I think that is really at the crux of so much of how we present our relationships, right? I mean, I'm thinking about, right, hierarchy, or I'm thinking about all of these homogeneity, right? All of that is sort of the bedrock of that is dualism, right? One is better or one is worse. One deserves to be on top while the other is on the bottom. I mean, I think dualism is really the crux of it all. And it's so steeped in Western thinking, and it's so personal too. And I think that's the thing about dualism, that it's not just how we view others, right? We see others, yes, us versus them, or this person, has more value than the other, whatever. but it's so personal. Dualism is so embedded into who we are. I mean, so much of how we view our own selves is so fragmented, and Christianity only makes this worse, the mind versus the body and the soul, the spirit versus the heart. And the heart is deceitful and the body is deceitful, and only the spirit, I mean, it's so embedded into how we think of ourselves. I mean, even me, as someone who feels like, I'm actively and intentionally trying to decolonize and actively trying to resist from these ideologies, I constantly find myself having to fight against a dualistic way of thinking, not just when it comes to others, really, but just in myself, and how I view my body, and how I even think about, again, my children, and just, bad and good, and right and wrong. And so much of life is not lived that way. And so I think it's such a cognitive dissonance that we all suffer from when we are so steeped in dualistic thinking all the time, and yet our lives are so non-dualistic. And so I feel like we're constantly trying to fight against what is real and we experience grief and joy at the same time, and yet we can't understand that. And so we push one away, or we feel guilty for, and I think it's a constant battle that we are fighting within ourselves. And so I think to resist dualism, right, in order to not see the other as an other, I think it starts with ourselves, right? It starts with our own bodies, to see it starts with our own minds. It starts with how we function in our own, day-to-day living. Because, man, that is one that I think is really tough, and because it has such really harmful repercussions throughout history, right? It really affects us personally, and then that reverberates, because how we treat our own bodies, how we treat our own selves, is how we're going to treat and how it's going to reflect to others. And so I think that one, to answer your question, how do we resist? I think it's a very, very personal journey of undoing dualism and really becoming comfortable with a paradox of what it means to be human, of what it means to sit here and experience, deep joy and love and beauty in my life, and also know that the world is full of such deep, deep pain, and not trying to ignore or erase one for the sake of the other. I think we need to hold that. I think we need to hold the pain and the grief of the world, and also just the beauty of our own lives, right? I put my children to bed, and I am overwhelmed with love for my children. And at the same time, I'm thinking about the children in Gaza who are dying of starvation. And that's not something I can settle within me. And I don't think that should be settled. I think that should just be a tension that we live in, and not ignore one for the other, or think one should be, and yeah. So I think it starts there.
I think we want to start there. You talk through a lot of things that we want to embrace as we're resisting empire, where we're embracing things like kinship, connection, wholeness, rest, peace. The question is, practically, now that we see the tentacles of empire have been embedded everywhere, and it's really difficult to get away from that, to be human again, how then should we live? What does it look like to actually live in a different way, a way that actually the tentacles are not wrapped around us anymore, pushing us to the margin, to the edge of society, but actually we're rooted, we're grounded, we're human with one another? What does that look like? Shifting culture is only possible because people believe these conversations matter. But to keep this show going, we need partners who will invest in it. Advertising on Shifting Culture not only sustains this community, it connects your message with an engaged audience that cares deeply about shaping a better world. If your mission aligns with ours, lifting up stories of hope, justice, creativity in the way of Jesus, then sponsoring this podcast is one of the best ways to make sure these conversations continue to reach thousands each month. If you're interested, email me at jjohnson@shiftingculturepodcast.com or follow the link in the show notes. And if you know someone whose organization should advertise here, please connect us. Together, we can keep this vision alive.
Yeah. Well, I think it's taking, as I mentioned earlier, taking a bit of all of this and starting where you can and where you are and what makes sense to you. And as you unravel, as you move forward in this notion of decolonizing, it's gonna start to make more sense for you, right? And so for me, and again, this journey is extremely personal, right? I don't think that any two people can be on the same journey because obviously we live in different places. We have different lives, we have different jobs, whatever. But I think for me, going back to writing Abuelita Faith, I mean, that was a big journey in that for me was embracing, what is it that faith that, the pastors on the pulpits and whatever have told me is genuine faith and have told me is true wisdom, and where have I experienced the divine outside of that, right? What is my truth in that? And that for me started with, the faith of abuela, the faith of my grandmother, and digging into the wisdom of my ancestors, the wisdom that formed me and that formed God in me, right? What does that wisdom look like? And then from there, I was on my own personal journey, right, of rediscovering that wisdom. And then for me, it was rediscovering my relationship to the land, right? My family, we decided to move out of the city and move into, out into the middle of the woods. And so that was our personal, journey. And we're working on, we have a relationship to the land and a relationship to the animals. We have a small farm. And, again, there's so many different ways, but I think, what does it look like to nurture something, to love something that is unloved, whether that be an actual physical thing that you can nurture, or what does it mean to build relationship with someone whom you can receive wisdom and love. And also, because something I talk a lot about too, and I've talked about this in Abuelita Faith, is that in so much a Christian relationship, those of us with privilege often feel like we need to be the ones, in the position of host, right? Or we need to be the ones that are hospitable or giving, but what does it look like to receive love from those deemed other? Or what does it look like to receive, these sorts of things from people that we've been told that we have nothing to receive from, right? And so I think it looks like there's so many ways that it can look like for us. I know for me, when I was living, back in the city, I had a relationship with this woman named Jessie, and I write about her in Sacred Belonging. But, she was a Black woman that lived in the neighborhood for as long as, as she could. And, for me, so much of my life-giving relationships that I experienced was sitting with Jessie, drinking Diet Cokes, talking about what the city, what it looked like, when she was a kid, and what life looked like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? And that, that gives me a bit of knowledge of my own history, of the land I sit on, of the ground that I walk on. You know what I mean? I mean, that for me felt like such a rooted, grounded thing, is to really, she was like the abuelita theologian in my neighborhood, and that was a really, for me, felt like a way to resist against, just all the noise was to sit and have a Diet Coke with Jessie and learn about, what this land was like, 30, 40 years ago. But, it goes beyond that. I think, as I mentioned earlier, what is our relationship with productivity, with time? Are we living by the seasons, right? Are we, understanding the way that the world is resting and dying and coming back to life? And are we allowing seasons of birth and death and rebirth in our own life? How do we function in relationships, in our, whether it's like our church jobs or whatever kind of work? I mean, how are there relationships of hierarchy? Are we, fostering true kinship, and that all there is true equality, and that we are learning from those deemed, less than? A small one for me is, I have a toddler, and my toddler takes forever to get out of the house, takes forever to put on her shoes, takes forever, and am I instilling this sort of empire's constant, need for urgency and for rush and for hustle in her by telling her to constantly hurry? Or am I making sure that I'm setting up my life in such a way that I'm not passing that on? I'm not passing on this need for constant urgency and hustle and productivity. Am I letting her just be? Am I, providing space in my day to just think and to just be? Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so many different ways that we can do this, that we can be in community with one another that is not relationships of, where it's not based on just simple charity, but based on receiving wisdom from others and belonging. I think belonging is a big one. And that's sort of the crux of this book, is because we all want to belong, right? I mean, I think that's the reason why we all go to church. I think that's the reason why we all seek out religion. I think that's the reason why one of the reasons I do believe that there's a spiritual component to that. But, I think that belonging is the foundation to so much of the human experience. But belonging with an empire is always conditional. You belong so long as X, Y, and Z, or you belong if X, Y, and Z. And I think that that's what we see in the church, right? You belong if you do these things or say this prayer or believe this exact, theology. But what would it look like to belong to a community or belong to a people that you belonged with no ifs or buts or conditions? And if you don't find that in the church, I think that, you can look for that elsewhere. I think that that's, where we can seek true belonging, is that if the church is, if where you're at right now is not, you're not finding that, then go somewhere else and start developing true belonging there. And you bring Jesus in there when you do that. You know what I mean? Like God goes with you there. I think I have a friend who, left the church because she was experiencing so much harm, and, she joined a rock climbing community, and, and she just has found beautiful, true belonging in this community, and is experiencing the love and the grace of Jesus in this community. And I think that, for so many Christians, we're so riddled with guilt, and we're so riddled with how we should be and how we should act and what we should be doing, that we stay in these places that are toxic and harmful. And all we're doing is just, redoing the cycle of harm that empire, wants us to, or has constructed.
No, all of those are so good. And I think we actually have to have a new vision of what life needs to be these days, especially when we're talking about like the productivity nature of society, of Western civilization, as we're continually moving, like progressing forward, multiplying, growing. We always have to have like growth of money,
Right.
or Western civilization doesn't really work. And
Right.
so if we're caught up in that,
Exactly.
I think this is why we have a loneliness epidemic. This
Right.
is why people don't know how to connect anymore. This
Right.
is why there is no belonging in a
Right.
certain thing, because we're cogs in the
Yes.
big machine that is leading us somewhere that is not like life. It's not
Right.
humanity. It's like machine.
Yes. I mean, yeah. And I write about in the book, I mean, if you go back to the history of wage labor, and I mean, literally leisure, like just fun, was actually constructed by, the overlords of capitalism, who constructed leisure and then put a price tag on it. They said, okay, this is when you're going to work. This is when you're going to be off. And then when you're off, we're going to charge you to take for a train ticket to go to a baseball game, and we've constructed this life really around being cogs in a machine. And I'm not here to say like, yes, jump off, but also I know that that's, virtually impossible in this society we live in because of the systems we live in. But I wonder, how can we begin to imagine something different? And I say that, I wish I can give, do this X, Y, and Z, but it's like I said, it's so personal, right? And so what are things that you can do in your life, as I write about in the book, before this whole wage labor and the where people had to work in factories and all that, and you had to work 9 to 5. Before that, I mean, people rested and ate and did all these things as the season and as life, sort of led them into. You're tired, you sleep. You stop and you rest. But now we don't know what that is. You're tired, you keep going. You're sick, you keep working. And so I just wonder, what incremental changes can you make in your life to seek out this other, to imagine a new way of being and to seek that out. I mean, that can literally mean going for a walk instead of sitting at your computer. I mean, it really can look like anything, but I think it just requires you to get imaginative and just look at your life, your day to day, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, and take inventory of all the things that is keeping you captive, whether it's to productivity or to any of these ideologies. And how can you just begin to untangle and unravel? For me, I wake my kids up an hour earlier so that they can take an hour longer to to put their shoes on, and I'm not rushing, right? I mean, we still end up rushing sometimes, fine, there's grace there. But I mean, like, what little changes can you make so that your life can start to look less like a cog in a machine and more like someone living in wholeness and someone flourishing and connected to true belonging? I know people might hear me say, like, leave the church if you're, and that may be like, make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I just mean that so much of the church too has become that, empire and imperialism. When I talk about the energy behind expansion, I mean, you see that so much in the church, right? It's just this energy of planting another one, of expanding to new territory, of just, try and push our ideology to new people and more people and save them so that they can become like us. And so when I say, find another space, I just mean, like, where is there not true belonging? If you're not experiencing that true belonging, if there is a push to be like empire, to wear you down like a cog in a machine, then I don't believe that's from God. I don't care what church it is. I don't believe that it doesn't, I'm not saying that whatever. I'm just saying that space that you're inhabiting, something needs to change. And maybe that starts with you. Fine. Maybe that doesn't mean leaving. Maybe that just means doing what it is that you need to do and changing, But I think that so much of empire's ideologies has so corrupted us and our churches that I think in order to find true liberation, it means, taking chances and being, just doing things that I think might ruffle some feathers and might just really just change our lives quite a bit. And it could start really incremental, but yeah.
That's so good, Kat. That's so good. And I think that's going to be liberating and helpful for a lot of people to actually be able to find belonging where they are and where they're at. As we end here, can you give me a couple recommendations? Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Okay, yeah. So let's see. I've been literally only reading fiction this year. I have not read one theology book all year. After I turned in my manuscript, I was like, and we're done reading theology. It's been wonderful. Yeah, I've read a lot of great fiction novels this year. My favorite is Elizabeth Strout's Tell Me Everything and The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. Those are just two, non-religious at all, but if anyone is interested. And then one show, I'm a big show person. I love TV shows. And I don't know if you've seen or if anyone's seen it. I don't think it's very, very popular, but it's called Resident Alien. And it's
Yeah,
funny
yeah, I've
because
seen it.
you've
It's
seen
fun.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I feel like it touches on so many themes of colonization and so many themes of what does it mean to be human and identity. And I always recommend this show when I'm talking about theology and empire because it's such a funny and quirky and weird and deep show that really, I think if you allow your imagination to go there, I think it could really take you into a lot of these different places and have you wrestling with a lot of really good things when it comes to what does it mean to be human and what does it mean what does it mean to arrive somewhere as a colonizer and be transformed instead of doing the trying to transform. But yeah.
Well, Liturgies for Resisting Empire is out early November, anywhere
Wonderful.
books are sold. Is there anywhere you'd like to point people to connect with you, to get the book?
Yeah. Well, if you want to send me a message on my website, catarmas.com. Also, my Substack is just catarmas at Substack or substack.com. I don't know how that how that is, but yeah, you can find me on Substack, on social media, cat_armas. And you can order my book right now for, if you're listening to this before it's out, it is 40% off and free shipping at bakerbookhouse.com. So I think that is a good deal if you want to go there.
Great. Well, Kat, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for taking us through empire, what it is, what it looks like, what you're trying to say within this book. As we're resisting empire, we're embracing all these other things that don't look like the tentacles of empire that have wrapped around us and have got all their tentacles in us. So thank you for this. It was fantastic. I really loved walking through it with you, and you are a gift to the world. And so thank you for your work and what you do. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. And it was wonderful chatting with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out, share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.